15 years now, where we organize different marketplaces into subways or tube lines. And so these are all the different marketplaces where we evaluate now close to about 180 vendors. And our core from the beginning was vendor evaluation, but over time, people started asking us, hey, can you help us actually select technology? Some of the help us choose which one is the best. And over time, we elaborated on what we would describe as sort of an agile-ish methodology, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. But if you look at this marketplace, or really these marketplaces, it's very interesting. You see a city center with some well-known names: Microsoft, Adobe, Oracle, Salesforce, Google kind of sneaking in there. And there's, in all these marketplaces, there's a city center, but there's also a pretty dedicated periphery where we know a lot of the innovation is happening. So these are what analyst firms call highly fragmented marketplaces, which means that there's a hell of a lot of vendors to choose from. And so we totally understand and empathize with some of the challenges that you face, sort of identifying, hey, what's the best fit for us? And our mission in life is to really be your guide and help you find the best fit. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this half hour together. So we're going to really hit on sort of 4 concepts. One is talking about shifting architectures, really important to understand the architectural basis for your decisions. Getting to know your marketplaces, why is that important? And then we'll spend the majority of our time on what is the right way to select marketing technology. And we'll summarize the key takeaways for you. So if we're going too fast to take notes, don't worry about it. It's all going to be in the deck that you'll get later. So we like to begin with architecture. This is our reference model for the 2020s. This is a target reference model. It probably reminds you a lot of other sort of layer cake diagrams where you have the engagement channels up front, then interaction delivery environments underneath the top, and then engagement services, where a lot of us have been sort of bulking up our capabilities. In this case, it's B2C, so you see things like customer care, loyalty, certainly outbound marketing, web content management, and so forth. And then we think the real innovation of this decade is bringing out enterprise foundation services in content and information management on the left, data in the middle, and then decisioning in the lower right. A set of capabilities, and again, these are not necessarily platforms, these are services that need to be channel agnostic if you're going to have a truly adaptable, flexible MarTech speed type stack where you're actually meeting your customers where they're at across the whole omni-channel spectrum. And so there's also a B2B equivalent of this as well, that looks at things like CRM and Salesforce automation, CPQ, sales enablement, a few things that are a little bit different, but conceptually still the same, right? That the real challenge for all of us, but particularly larger enterprises over this decade, is abstracting out and really providing these enterprise foundation services that are independent of specific engagement channels. So any way you slice it, the key thing is that you have an architectural model that helps you understand what services reside where, and then you can begin to have a much less, I'll say much more candid and less bullshitty conversation with your vendors about what capabilities are they going to provide for you and what capabilities you don't want them to provide for you. Of course, one of the big things that we've all seen in the past couple of years is the rise of AI. We really have changed our model where we see AI as kind of a layer at the enterprise foundation level with generative insights and decisioning. A lot of emphasis on generative right now. We think actually the bigger play in MarTech is probably going to be around insights and decisioning AI. Talk about that some more if you're interested. The point here is that, of course, a lot of vendors are introducing AI as a kind of a feature, injecting it into their platform. You don't necessarily want to go that route for any number of different reasons. And so architecturally, we would tend to say, think of it more as a layer. Whether you agree with that or not, hopefully you understand the larger point here that you need to have an argument about what your stack looks like and what capabilities you want to reside there. And if you don't have that, then the vendors are going to lead you around by the nose. So for example, if you just look at customer data platforms or CDP technology, really hot right now, where's the best, what capabilities should it provide us? There's a lot of disagreement about that in the marketplace and among even the different enterprises that we advise. And so there's different design patterns here. So one pattern says, look, all I need out of my CDP is this orange box customer data activation. That ought to be just the core, which is fine. And some of our subscribers go that route. Others say, well, no, maybe the scope is to help with some lower level operations and data intelligence. Many CDPs also now provide lightweight decisioning services. Some CDPs also bundle outbound marketing. Maybe you want those things, maybe you don't. Maybe it fits into your architecture, maybe it doesn't. So the point here is really to think in terms of services and making sure you at least have some provisional thinking. What's the scope that I want out of this platform? And so that helps you then go avoid these procurements that we often see where you've got apples and oranges and different vendors sort of competing with different capabilities. Becomes very impossible to compare them head to head. And what they're really doing is presenting an argument over your architecture by way of a product selection. And what we always advise and what we help all of our customer clients with is create an architecture first, then figure out what capabilities you need, then compete vendors head to head. So this of course plays out in terms of marketplace choices. So I'll just give you a couple of example marketplaces just to think about here. So one is the web content management marketplace, a very mature marketplace. It's been around now for really 30 years at some level, at least 28. And as a mature marketplace, an active marketplace, we're seeing a lot of replacement going on, but still a mature marketplace. There's been a lot of compression, and the best way to really look at this is on the kind of a complexity spectrum. So you have native richness and customizable and extensibility towards the left, but then less complexity, less developer intensivity, and lower cost over on the right. And these things play themselves out as trade-offs. What's interesting, again, is how compressed this marketplace has become. A lot of really good choices in the upper range and mid-range. The lower range now kind of fallen off towards more site builder. The toolkits category has not been terribly popular. Really, there's just kind of Adobe sitting there now. Even Adobe, the number of organizations are rethinking their investments in Adobe sites. And so this is an understanding of the market, and the reason why we're arguing for an understanding of the market is not solely because this is what we do as a business, but because we very, very, very often see enterprise selection teams where their shortlists are just all over the map, right? It's not just that they're in different categories, but that they're spanning this broad range of capabilities. And if you're doing that intentionally, okay, that's fine, but very often we see that unintentionally. So really understanding where you fit on the complexity, value, cost spectrum is terribly important. And we have always said, by the way, that it's an axiom of MarTech that you have a greater risk of overbuying than underbuying. It sounds counterintuitive, but we've seen more grief come from enterprises that overbuy and buy something too complex rather than buying something not complex enough. So that's one case, a mature marketplace. Digital asset management, also very much like this as well. CDP, younger marketplace, arguably only 5-6 years old, and so it's still kind of playing itself out. We tend to look at it in a different way. There's the on the vertical axis, there's a distinction we're making between independent players versus these massive suites. In general, you want to stay away from the CDPs, from suite vendors. That's a whole nother story. But then even among the independents, there's a very much a difference functionally and architecturally. Is the focus on data processing, or is the focus more on customer data leverage? So as analysts, of course, we create these nice, neat little boxes. In the real world, vendors don't always live nicely or happily within different boxes. But the point here, again, is to have some frame of reference for the market that you're addressing, and then you can create much better shortlists. Of course, you can go to our website and find some of the shortlist tools that we have, like Real Quadrant and Real-Time. Try them out for yourself and see what you think. But the point here is really beginning to at least do some diligence about the market itself. Obviously, this is an area we can help you, but you don't want to go in here blind. Okay. So now the meat of the conversation is the right way to select marketing technology. So I'll tell you right up front, we think that the right way is to apply the principles of design thinking which is an antidote to the traditional, more waterfall-oriented approaches to selecting technology. And this is particularly germane when we're talking about marketing technology. So you want the process to be business focused. Doesn't mean that your technical requirements don't matter, but at the end of the day, you have to meet some business objectives. It needs to be team based. So you want to bring in, because we're talking about MarTech, you want to bring in marketing people, technology people, and increasingly bring in data people as well into the selection team. You make it empirical, which means test-based, and this is critical, and this is what many organizations don't do. And it's very dangerous not to do that, but also highly valuable to make it more test-based. And iterative, which means you don't have to have perfect requirements at first. You can iterate and adapt and learn by actually testing the tools what's most important for you. So this is, like I said, the more antidote approach to some of the ways that we've seen organizations in the last 2 decades select technology. So one is love at first sight. You know, I went to this conference or I sat in on this webinar. Oh my God, this vendor, it's amazing. It can only do this. We got to go get it. And the reality is, of course, that like in the real world, love at first sight in the software world typically doesn't turn out so well. And you have to know that all competitors always, all vendors always have competitors. The second the approach that we often see is what we call my cousin Vinny, where some organization in your that you know of picked a particular vendor, so you want to go with that vendor too. And the reality is that what works for your cousin Vinny doesn't always work for you. There's a similar model here that people who license Gartner and Forrester research often turn to, like, what's a horse rate? Who's ahead? Who's behind? I want to go with the winning vendor. And the reality is there is no winning vendor. There is a vendor that's the right fit for you. Number 4 is sort of a comfortable set of dungarees. There's this vendor that we've always used and we're going to just keep using them. And that may be good or it may not be. Number 5 is sort of abdicating the problem. We see this on both the marketing side and the IT side sometimes, which is this is somebody else's problem. Let them pick the tool, let them deal with it. And you don't want that. You really want to put your oar in the water and make sure that something is going to work for your team. Number 6 is the most common approach, where we create these long Excel spreadsheets, must have, should have, rank order, all this other things, and send that to the vendor and have them fill out the forms. And they know how to fill these out. They've always filled them out, and you get them back. And at the end of the day, there's nothing differentiating. The big problem with this from a design thinking standpoint is that it's not human, right? It's not based on real life flows about how you would actually work. Now, we very often see that vendors turning to incumbent. So we may already have a strong relationship with Microsoft, Oracle, Salesforce, Adobe, so we're just going to use what they have. The problem with this is, let's say that your marketer needs to drill a hole in a piece of wood every Friday afternoon, then you know, someone may say, oh, look, Salesforce has this drill press that we can use. And that's totally the wrong way to do it. Sure, you can invite Salesforce to the competition, but you definitely want to compete it so that you get the right platform for your marketing people. Okay, so what's a better way of doing this? Is to apply design thinking. Now, just want to remind you again, if you have any questions or anything you wanted to share, comments, or anything you disagree with, feel free to chime in the your GoToWebinar control panel. There should be a little tab there for questions. Feel free to ask any question or share any comment that you want. We're definitely gonna have time for that. So design thinking, you've probably all seen this before. We've seen different definitions. We happen to like this particular definition from David Kelly, where you're focusing on empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And so, you know, it's a human-centered approach. And that's really the key thing, is that it's a very human-centered approach. And we found, even with the most technically intensive selections that we've guided, this human-centered approach just yields much better, much faster, much more enduring results. The way that this works is, you can think of it as an inverted triangle, that as you're creating user stories and you may be looking at a marketplace like CDP or WCM with 30 or so vendors, those user stories are the key to the whole process. You don't want to use the vendors' user stories. You want to create your own to-be user stories. And then those then become the basis for a definitional phase where you're creating an RFP or request for demos and a vendor shortlist at this point. It may include 6 to 8 vendors initially, and then you winnow that down to 4 where you're reviewing their proposals and demos. But then definitely always have a hands-on bake-off phase where you're actually testing the tools before you sign a contract. And then optionally, you can always do a POC while you're negotiating the contract. The POC typically dealing with more technical, more integration type issues. So there's a lot that we could say about this. If you work with us further, we have a whole methodology. We've got books we can share with you on this. But there were a couple things I wanted to just peel out. One was to make sure that you had a cross-functional selection team. This can depend on the type of solution that you're selecting. You always want a business lead with a separate project manager. You want a diverse set of interested stakeholders. And it's interesting with MarTech, you know, we typically don't see teams smaller than 12 people because there's a lot of important personas who need to be part of this decision. Of course, not every stakeholder needs to be on the selection team. You may have 36 stakeholders, but maybe only 12, 15 people on the selection team. That's normal, that's fine. You don't want these people to be too senior though, because if they're too senior, then they're not going to be able to participate in the critical empirical part of this, where you're actually doing hands-on testing. Now you want to evaluate vendors not based on features, but based on use cases. And so this is very familiar to us because this is how we evaluate vendors. So here's the 10 different evaluation criteria that we use for CDPs. Note that we don't do things like, you know, robustness or all of these other sort of vague, meaningless criteria. We're sort of like, okay, what capabilities do they actually support and how effectively do they support them? What did they have in mind as excelling at when they built this software? And typically, no CDP vendor is going to excel at more than 2 or 3 of these things, and maybe sort of have a story around 2 or 3 others and not do the other 4. And that's fine. The key thing, of course, is to match your internal use cases against what the vendor excels at. Again, we have some tools here that can help you with the matching, but the key thing here is to think about in terms of use case fit. The other thing I wanted to mention was this bake-off, and the reason there's a lot to say about all 5 of these phases, but the bake-off in particular, I really want to focus your mind around, because quite honestly, too many enterprises, including large, super experienced, super savvy enterprises, skip this step, and you should never skip this step. Remember that the bake-off happens while the vendors are still competing. They're competing on price, they're competing on terms, they're competing on functionality, they're competing on architecture fit. And you want to be able to test them in a hands-on way before you actually sign a license. This is very readily done. We've done dozens and dozens, we've guided dozens and dozens and dozens of these. The more complicated ones might take a little longer than a week. The simpler ones take only a couple days. Just don't skip this step. Would you buy a car without actually test driving it? No. So you really need to test drive the technology. Use real scenarios. If you can, real content. Maybe it's dummy data until the POC, that's fine, but real people, a real environment. And this will tell you what the software wants to do readily and what the platform you're going to have to struggle with, even if it's the winning platform. Also gives you time to test the vendor itself. And in the end, the vendor and the ecosystem around the vendor can be as decisive or more decisive than the actual platform itself. So it gives you a much more hands-on, holistic, realistic, and we're all about real here, realistic view of what the platform will do. Okay, so a couple key takeaways slides here, and then we will definitely be open for whatever questions or comments you'd like to lend to the process. So I want to just review some key agile selection concepts. One is, you know, be clear about your business case. What are you trying to accomplish? Because that's going to drive your use cases. Definitely build a cross-departmental team that has a chair and a project manager. Center your RF, whether it's an RFI, RFP, RFD, RFQ, whatever it is, tender. Center it on people-oriented use cases. It doesn't mean that you can't ask other questions, particularly technical questions. You should, but they should be more how questions rather than what questions. And then you want to follow an adaptive model that says, look, we had a certain set of scenarios or use cases in our RFP. based on the vendor proposals. We're going to change those a little bit for the demo round. Based on what happened in the demos, we're going to change them again and adapt them for the bake-off round. This is totally normal. You're learning as you go through this process. You'll never, ever get your requirements perfect up front. So stop spending too much time making them perfect. Instead, get to a proposal round or a demo round with imperfect requirements, and then have your real life experience with the tools, then improve them. So you definitely want realistic testing and simulation. This brings contrasts into high relief. So you never skip a bake-off. Negotiate early and often. So what this means is you're negotiating at the proposal round, you're negotiating at the demo round, you're negotiating at the bake-off round. And this is how you get to the best possible deal for your enterprise. So if we look at this kind of more holistically, you know, that those takeaways were a little bit more tactical about the selection methodology that, again, is all sort of encapsulated in this book, and we definitely bring it to our advisory work with you. There's some larger pictures here. So first, understand how your overall MarTech, CX, DX stack, how those pieces are going to fit together from a services standpoint, and then plug in vendors. Some vendors may handle more than one service. You may need multiple vendors for one service. So it's not like every box always has just a single logo, but the point is that you have an actual stack plan and roadmap. If you hit a roadblock in this whole process, you can work backwards from the customer experience. What are we trying to do for our prospects and customers, and then work backward. But part of that then is identifying the gaps and opportunities in the broader stack context, and using the selection to fill those in. In the year of our Lord 2024, you need to be thinking about an omni-channel future with AI as a layer, not as a feature. And so make sure that all of your selections and your strategies kind of encompass those two dimensions. And what this inevitably means is extracting enterprise services from engagement silos. So you don't want your marketing automation platform to be a data management platform. You don't want your web content management system to be an omni-channel content platform. Engagement platforms were designed to engage. They're not necessarily designed to do foundational work with data, content, and decisioning. You definitely want to research the marketplaces. We're biased because we produce this research, but understanding the marketplace and where your needs fit in saves you a lot of time and, quite frankly, a lot of heartburn. Now, you always want to focus on fit, right? You're not getting the best vendor, you're getting the best fitting vendor. And so you want to avoid vendor reputation, or that because a vendor is larger, that somehow their solution is going to be more enduring or more powerful. The best fit for you is the best fit, and the way that you test that is by centering on real human-centered stories that you can go out and test yourself. You do this adaptively, starting with a proposal, leading to demos and a bake-off. And then finally, you get to an implementation, and we always say implement joyfully. And the reason why we say that is because MarTech implementations have a way of never ending. We're working with some of our clients on 3-year roadmaps for some of their rollouts, and that's totally realistic. So the implementations don't end. This has implications, of course, about implementation partners and implementation strategies and all sorts of other things, but you have a much better chance of implementing joyfully if you make the right fit in the first place. So there's 3 ways that Real Story Group can help you do this. One is help you find the best fit vendor, and you can do that by licensing any of our so-called streams here. So any of these lines on the subway map, if you're in the market right now looking for a solution, you can subscribe to our research, get all the inside dope on the vendors, along with a number of comparison tools like Real Quadrant that you see in the upper corner. Some of our larger subscribers just license all of our research because they need it all the time, and they get a so-called full stack subscription that then we spend our advisory time then helping them think through larger stack issues as well as individual marketplace issues. A subset of those take advantage of a third offering, which is our private exclusive MarTech Council, MarTech Stack Leadership Council, who are MarTech leaders at large enterprises who meet 3 or 4 times a year, including twice in person. They're completely vendor-free, consultant-free, We just get you all together, we share stories, we share lessons, we talk about what we're doing in the future, we learn from each other, we network. A wonderful opportunity. If you're a MarTech leader, feel free to inquire with us about that. So here's how you can get in touch with us, Scott. I'll let you talk about next steps, and then meanwhile, we have gotten a couple of questions. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to just jump in and ask.
Great, thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, the core of everything we do is in our research, and you can download excerpts from any of the research areas that we cover. Do so at the coordinates here on our website. If you'd like to see more of behind the scenes tour of what will be available to you as a Real Story Group subscriber, just drop us a line and we can get that scheduled for you and talk with you in more detail about the different offerings that we have available. And if you're interested in attending more of these webinars, we have several more coming up over the next few weeks in this exact same time slot. Next week, we'll be talking about the DAM trends to watch in 2024, followed by CDP trends to watch in 2024. And then a really interesting topic a few weeks after that will be the future of journey orchestration in an AI world. So hope to see you at some or all of those events. With that, it does look like a few questions have come in. Tony, you want to take those away?
Yeah, real quickly, I accidentally deleted one of the questions. It was about how versus what, the comment I made, how versus what. So if the person who put that in could kindly just re-enter it, I would be very grateful. In the meantime, James has a question. On the agency side, there seems to be none that can really handle all the vendors' offerings. Do you suggest hiring a range of agencies that specialize in the chosen vendor once you get there? So it's hard to tell. If you're talking about a vendor with multiple offerings, that's right. You're likely to have to work with different consultancies that specialize in those different offerings. That's why oftentimes it's not a really great consolidation story to work with a single MarTech suite vendor. We would, depending on what you're trying to do, we would tend to argue that the number one thing you want in an outside implementation partner is knowledge of that platform. And so that means working with multiple different implementation partners and having to serve as a bit of a general contractor. That's better than having one of them serve as a general contractor and then one of them taking a number of different platforms, some of which they don't know very well. So Ken is asking, what if a vendor has a modular approach, for example, DAM, a workflow, creative automation with more of an ecosystem build? POC will need a lot of resources to build out. What would you recommend for demonstration of the platform? So, if the scope of what you're trying to do is all those capabilities, then there's nothing wrong with that. It's an expansive sort of selection where you're looking for either a single platform that can handle all of these things or potentially multiple platforms. So we've definitely organized selections like that where you may have a single omnibus provider that has multiple capabilities and maybe some partners that they're going to bring in. And then you have other best of breed players that you bring in as well. And so you can, at the end of the day, you can make this apples and apples. It just takes a little bit of creativity. Jonathan is saying, it sounds like MarTech is a journey and not a destination. That is absolutely true. Thank you for summarizing. I think what took us, it took me 10 minutes to say, Jonathan, definitely a journey. And so one of the things that we would argue is that as an enterprise capability, one of the things you have to get good at, besides the critical architecture piece that I manage, is just getting good at selecting new technologies, whether it's something simple, like a simple collaboration platform, or it's something super complicated, like a heavyweight CDP. It's clear, Ted is saying, it's clear your research covers vendors intensively, and that's great, but do you also cover industry trends or have industry use cases? So we tend not to isolate a lot of use cases. That tends to be more vendor work, and we leave it for the vendors, but we definitely isolate a lot of trends. We get asked about trends from our subscribers, and so our research there is more qualitative than quantitative, Ted, so I would just concede that. Where we've done a lot of really interesting trends work is with our council, with our MarTech Executive Leadership Council, where we brought them together and we've kind of co-created what we think are trends. So Steve is saying what versus how, not a question. By the way, thanks for re-entering this, Steve. What versus how, I thought it was a great point. Yeah, so just as an aside, we often see in RFPs, do you do this, do you do that, do you do the other things, do you integrate with Salesforce? You know, every vendor is going to say yes. Any question like that, always put a how in front. How do you integrate with Salesforce? You get a totally different answer that's going to be much more useful for you, because the vendors, the do you, what do you do, vendors will just check the box. How do you do it is going to do two things. First, it's going to be a much richer conversation with the vendor, but secondly, it's how vendors end up really differentiating, is how they do things even more so than what they do. So with that, we're going to wrap things up. Thanks for sticking around a little bit later, and always a pleasure to chat with you. So for my colleague Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne signing out for Real Story Group. See you next time. Bye.